All right, everybody, we will go ahead and get started. The goal of ASU Innovation Talks is to connect faculty from our Alliance partner universities around the world to researchers and educators at Arizona State University. We all share the goal of effectively preparing the next generation of citizens for the future. These ASU Innovation Talks bring professors and educators together to focus on how best to do this through our daily teachings of students. A sincere thank you to Santana Education for their sponsorship of these lectures and to Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara for providing Spanish translation. Remember, if you want to hear this webinar in Spanish, just click the globe icon. You may also want to use one of these text translation apps as our presenter talks about how to use AI tools. You can practice using these tools alongside our presenter. In today's innovation talk for faculty, we're considering our deep dive into generative AI and how it will shape the future of higher education. Today's topic looks at the transformative potential and risks of generative AI, particularly how these benefits and risks affect our teaching at universities. Now, let's welcome Dr. Punya Mishra, who is a professor at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College for Teaching and Learning and Innovation at Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us today, Professor, and the rest of the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amelia. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever people are in the world. It's always tricky what the right greeting should be. I'm going to share my screen before I start off. So let's just do that. I'm really glad to be here. Do you see a blank screen? All right, perfect, perfect. So thank you again for inviting me to speak. I know a couple of other people of my colleagues have spoken, and they spoke very highly of the conversation that emerged out of this. So I'm really glad to be here. This is who I am professionally. I'm the Director of Innovative Learning Futures at the Learning Engineering Institute and a professor at Mary Lou Fulton College for Teaching and Learning Innovation. This is my contact information. Almost everything that I do is public. I share publicly on my website. So those of you who want to learn more and follow up should go there. My email is punya@asu.edu. I do reply to every email that I get. So if you have any follow-up questions, want to discuss anything more, want to learn more, do feel free to email me. And finally, almost all that stuff I do, I share out on LinkedIn. So that maybe is another possible way of staying in touch. So one of the things that, the thing that I'm going to be talking about today is this idea of teaching and learning in an age of generative AI. And, it's kind of interesting when I got interested in psychology and how our mind works and so on, back when I was in high school in India, actually through reading about AI, which is so it's almost like my life has come full circle in that regard. And here we are, I never thought that I would see that within my lifetime. In another presentation, I've often talked about how growing up in a remote part of India, a place called Mizoram, which is sort of in between Bangladesh and Myanmar, I didn't even have electricity for the first few years. And in this lifetime, I have gone from not having electricity, leading a life without that, to a point where we are talking about these generative AI tools and so on. So it's kind of an interesting arc, and I'm not even that old, to come to think of it. So November 2022, AI sort of burst into our consciousness with the release of this thing called ChatGPT. But we have to recognize that AI has been with us for a long time. I mean, if you look at, all of these different things, if you use Siri and Alexa, and if you use Google Photos, Facebook, different forms of artificial intelligence have been a part of our life, haven't, one could almost argue, controlling a huge segment of our lives through their algorithms. What something different happened with these large language models, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to sort of explain all these new tools that have emerged now. We know ChatGPT, of course, being the first one. Now we have Claude and Bing Chat and Gemini and Perplexity, and then you have all these image generation ones. We now have, DeepSeek, Deep Research. I mean, there is no end, and it keeps coming more and more and more, right? And when it first came out, one of the first sort of responses from the educational community was this is the end of education as we know it, that this would be used as a device to cheat and all that kind of stuff. And, it sort of was reminiscent of the conversation when Wikipedia first came out, let's say 2 decades ago. It's like, oh, everybody's going to just copy and paste from Wikipedia and nobody's going to learn anything anymore. And I think that some of those Fears were misplaced, and I think that it would be the same in this case as well, though we will talk more about what that is, right? And as this technology sort of got into our public, spaces, got into our heads, we started seeing a slightly different conversation as to, that it is going to change education, not destroy it, that some educators are embracing it, that we should be teaching with it, that it'll change it, And so you have these both sides of the sort of argument going on. One thing is for sure, though, is that for many educators and leaders and administrators, this pace of change is not something they were ready for. It's not like they were sitting and waiting and saying, "Oh, I wish there was a chatbot that could, help my students with homework," right? And so we did a survey of a whole bunch of educational leaders in the K-12 space, and the common response was, "Can we please slow it all down?" Because the pace of change was so fast. Now, partly because the pace is so fast, and partly because these AI companies have a huge, incentive to make this technology look like it's all powerful and so on. I think there are lots of myths about what this technology is. So I want to spend a little bit of time sort of trying to explain what generative AI is and what it is not. I think first and foremost, to be very clear, it is not a search engine. It is not a truth machine. It doesn't have all the knowledge that it can spout out correctly all the time. So to understand what it is, I think we need to go and look a little deeper how this technology works and how it compares to how we as humans think. So we live in this real world. This is the world of reality we live in. And a segment of that world, we get through our senses. So, I cannot see ultraviolet, which, other animals can see. So there are parts of the world that are not accessible to me. But there are parts of the world that are accessible to me through sight and touch and smell and, all of that. And through that, we form representations of the world in our brains. So I have a sense that if I pick up a pencil and I drop it, that it's going to fall. Even though I might not know the theory of gravity, I have a sense of how these things will work. Now, as humans, we use language, we are creative, so we create a whole variety of external representations of this world that is in our head. It could be in the form of poetry, it could be in the form of cinema, it could be in the form of scientific theories, it could be in the form of sketches and drawings and art. All of these things are external representations. And it's important to recognize one thing here, that there is a feedback loop, which is if I have a theory which says that gravity, if I drop something, it's going to fly away, and then I actually drop something and it falls to the ground, I have to change the concepts that are in my head. I have to change the external representations of that. So in this form, there is this sort of a feedback loop which keeps us more or less connected to the truth and to reality. Now, uh, over the past 20, 25 years, a huge chunk of these external representations, but not all of it, have been digitized. And I think it's important to recognize, particularly when we're speaking with international populations, that much of the digitization has happened in sort of the Western countries, right? A lot of the stuff there, while in other places, not so much. And I think that has an impact on how these large language models behave. Now, these small chunk of these broader external representations and then are used to train these large language models. So one thing that's really important to understand is that there is really no feedback loop between these new models and the real world. I think that's incredibly important to understand. While the representation that we form in our head are continuously being tested by other people, by tested by the reality of the world, and so on. So there is a sort of a feedback loop there, which is missing in these large language models. I think that's really important to understand as I go forward. Secondly, trying to understand how does it actually work? What does it do with all this digitized data? To recognize that what it is essentially is seeing patterns. So for instance, if I go into a large language model and I type in, let's say ChatGPT, I say the sky is, and the large language model then takes that and looks through the patterns that it has and comes up with a series of possible next words. So one word it could be would be blue, it could be clear, it could be usually. And so then it makes a decision based on some kind of an algorithm what word it should spit out, and it does, and it says the sky is blue, right? It could have chosen clear, and then the sentence would have gone on in a different way. What is important, critically important to understand here, is that the meaning of the words does not matter. It doesn't care what the words that you enter are. So, for instance, I could enter something completely random like cubicle stars drink. And the large language model would go do its probabilistic sort of search and come up with some options. It might come up with light, D, or dust, and it'll choose the first one. It'll say cubicle stars drink light. It has no understanding of what these words mean, but it just picks up something probabilistically. And you might actually end up with a kind of a poetic statement like cubicle stars drink light, and you can start a poem that way, right? But the meaning is not important. And so when people say that these large language models hallucinate, sometimes I say actually all they do is hallucinate. That is their true nature. They're always just probabilistically coming up with next word and the next word and the next word. If you're creating an image, the next pixel and the next pixel and the next pixel, it has no understanding of what it is spitting out. Very, very important to understand. Second, even small changes, if you make one word all caps, it can make differences to the kinds of patterns it recognizes. So you see a great amount of variability in the responses. I think that's really, really important to recognize as well, that small changes in input can lead to quite a big changes in the output, right? Because it has no connection with reality, it's just making stuff up. So my friend Leon Furs, who I actually was chatting with just last night, he's in Australia, he made this great statement saying chatbots don't make sense, they make words. So that's a really, really important thing to understand, that they are not meaning making machines, right? They are word generation machines or pattern recognition machines. Now, if we dig in a little deeper, when ChatGPT first came out, I do a lot of experiments with ChatGPT and other tools to see how they function, what they can do well, what they can't do well. And so I gave it, I had written a poem about, I have written a series of poems about mathematics. And I said, okay, can this large language model do that? Can it write a poem which is in the form of a proof of a mathematical theorem? Then I added another layer. I said, can you put an error in the proof so that a reader now has to find the error in the proof? And within seconds, after a couple of iterations, let's say a few minutes, we had a poem which was a proof of Euclid's proof of the infinity of primes, but it included a subtle error in the proof. And the error was so thoughtful and insightful, because there are websites, and you can go to my website and see these entire transcripts of these conversations. I have websites which make the same error. So think about what the large language model had to do. It had to understand the idea of poetry. It had to understand, and I'm going to putting it in quotes, right? Because it doesn't really understand anything. But in some way, it had to figure out what a poem was, what Euclid's proof was, the kinds of errors we make, and then insert that and write a poem. If a human had done this, we would definitely call them smart. So what do we make of the fact that Gen AI does this in seconds and can create another, another, each unique in any genre? And I could say, make it a rap song, and multiple languages. That's just, I mean, I remember when I did this, I was like blown away. Here's another fantastic example. So this is a photograph I took when I was a graduate student at Urbana-Champaign. We had a total solar eclipse, and I took a picture of the ground. And what you're seeing in these little circles are the gaps between the leaves acting as tiny pinhole cameras. So you just see thousands of eclipses on the ground around you. So I asked ChatGPT, what is this? And again, you can go read the transcript on my website. And it said, this photo was taken during an eclipse. When I told that it was in the 1990s and the location, it figured out the date and the approximate time it was taken. And again, I was blown away. Now, moving on to another example. So this is a classic optical illusion. So if you look at this, you may perceive the circle on the right-hand side, one surrounded by the smaller black dots, as appearing bigger than the one on the left-hand side. So I asked Claude and Chat, a bunch of them, which red circle is bigger? And it said both red circles are of the same size. This is the classic Ebbinghaus illusion. So I was like, oh, LLMs are quite smart. And then I did this. I created a version of the illusion which was not an illusion. I'd made one red circle massively bigger than the other one. And I asked, which red circle is bigger? And the LLM said, wait for it, both red circles are the same size. And I was like, what? One is definitely bigger than the other, but it said they are the same size. So that sort of reveals to you, I think this is a very good example of that. It can appear very smart, but it can also, because it's based on the training it's on. So here is one that all of you can try. You can go to ChatGPT and you say, create a photorealistic image of 5 clock faces, all showing the time as 6:30. It's very, very simple prompt. And this is what you get. You get all these clocks showing the time as 10 past 10. And why is that? because it has been trained on thousands and thousands of images, because this is what is typically used in advertising to show clocks at 10 past 10, because it looks like a smile. It, can show you the logo of the company and it doesn't hide it. So you can try any other time, you are always going to get something like 10 past 10. So it is not surprising that we get these kinds of news, right? We AI tutor which struggled with math, chatbots that ask people to break the law, so on and so forth. And so the first conclusion was that LLMs are really smart, and the second conclusion is they're also drunk. They can sometimes, take a sip and they'll be like, oh, and they'll come up with silly stuff, right? So here's another level. So I don't know if you've ever tried creating scientific diagrams using these image models. So here is a diagram of the ear, nose, and throat system of humans that I asked it to create. And it said, here it is, and this should be used for educational purposes in a medical or biology class. So it was very confident about the result that it had given. And if you know anything about the ear, nose, throat system, this is garbage. This has nothing to do with how our ear, nose, throat system works. You can see nusopharmics. It has made up words. It has labeled. It looks on the surface very beautifully rendered, but it is complete garbage. And, so that leads me to the second part of it, which is that, but it is absolutely confident about its result. It has no doubt about it that this is a beautiful diagram that you can use for teaching. So it says LLMs are smart, drunk, and supremely confident all the time, right? That brings us me to the research that we've been doing around how these systems can be biased. So here is an experiment that we did. So we took a student essay and we gave it to the LLM to evaluate. In one prompt, we said this passage was written by an eighth grade student who is from a black family. In the other one, we said this passage was written by an eighth grade student who comes from a white family. And we gave it to the LLM and we asked it to score the essay and give feedback. I don't know what you are thinking you will get. We were surprised by the fact that the results were almost explicit, like same. It did not care if it said coming from a black family and coming from a white family. We were puzzled by that because we had thought that it would make a difference. But most probably they have built these guardrails to prevent any explicit questions about race, to be careful about the responses. But then we made one change. We said this passage was written by an eighth grade student who attends an inner city school. And the other one, we said an elite private school. So instead of explicitly calling out the race of the student, we used things which were correlated, right? And then, boom, the bias comes explicitly out. It comes clean. So this is actually very almost scary and insidious, because this means that explicitly, if you ask these things about race or gender or things that way, it will be careful, but it will sneak it in if we are subtle about it. So here is another study that we did. We took an essay. This time we didn't say anything about the race of the student, the gender of the student. We kept it completely blank. But we said, here is an essay written by a student. Please evaluate it and give a score, blah, blah, blah. The only difference between the two essays was one word, where you say use. Then I need to get energized, so I just walk around a bit, usually with some rap music playing. In the other case, we said usually with some classical music playing. One word, no mention of the student's race or gender or identity, anything. And just that one word made the LLM give the student with rap a lower score than the student with classical music. So it had inferred from that one word, made inferences about the student, about their race and gender and so on, and made a difference. So it tells you how subtle and how powerful these tools are and how subtle these influences can be. So we've talked about bias. There are other kinds of bias as well. So for instance, AI has a hotness problem. So here is an image that I gave it of a classroom in India, and I asked it to replicate that image. And as you can see, the children in the other image are almost perfect. This is one that experiment that I did on myself. This is me and my colleague, Melissa War. She's the one with whom I do a lot of these bias studies. She leads the way on that. And I gave it that image and asked her to replicate, and look at me. I am so much slimmer and more good looking than in the original one. And so we live in a world where there already we have body image issues and so on. What does it mean when there's a technology out there which is always making things look better? Similarly, it was very easy for AI to take my Indian accent and erase it without even my asking for it. So there are these elements of bias that are built into these systems that we need to think about. So I've thrown a lot at you so far. We have talked about how these large language models work, which is basically on probabilistic reasoning, that it is trained on a subset of the digitized nature of the world, that it has no connection to reality. And then we have talked about sort of the bias and all of that stuff. So I'm going to put all of these together into one statement. So if there's one thing that I want you, all of you to take away today, is this one: that chatbots are smart, drunk, biased, supremely confident interns. So, what you have with you now is 24/7 available, ready to please, eager to please. They're incredibly smart. They do know a lot, but they can make massive mistakes, just as we saw with the optical illusion, just as we saw with the illustrations. So, they can be occasionally drunk. They are biased because the training data that we have given them, that is a biased training data because they're trained on us, and we have, we are racist, we are all this stuff is out there in the world. Yet it is always supremely confident. Whenever it gives an answer, it is like, yep, this is the right answer, even though it might be complete nonsense or it might be true. Who knows? It doesn't know. That's the main point. But it is an intern, it's an assistant who is with us all the time. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think we can work with this amazing technology quite intelligently. So one other guideline that I use is that I use AI when accuracy does not matter. So if I'm looking for the date of something, if I'm looking for the names of, of journal articles or citations, it is bound to hallucinate, or at least I cannot trust its output, which means I have to go and double check, which sometimes becomes twice as much work. But for brainstorming as a creative partner, it can actually be quite powerful. So as we look at So at this point, I'll just take a pause and catch up with what we have been talking about so far. We've talked about how these large language models work. We have talked about how they can do amazing things, but they can also make amazing mistakes, that they're biased in certain ways, that they really are not concerned with truth at all or what's out there in the world, that they are basically just probabilistic machines that churn out very confidently the next word or the next pixel as we go on. Now, coming to generative AI in education, I talked a little bit about the fact that, when it first came out, there was this fear about like, oh, plagiarism and so on and so forth. And, we have, I think, sort of moved away from that, though that is still, I think, a major concern. It does mean we have to rethink the assessments and all that we have been doing. But one of the things that I feel that we might be missing the boat, because I think so far there has been a strong focus on efficiency, that we can do things faster and better than we could do before. So most of the discussions have been on things like lesson planning and course design, accessibility and differentiation, which I think is actually a very powerful use of this technology. Our ability to convert ideas and make it, more accessible to younger ages or people with less knowledge about the field and so on. I think that's a really powerful tool. Also for assessments and feedback. I do want to underline over and over again that we have to be very careful about each of these uses because, as that rap and classical example showed, these are really powerful pattern matching technologies. So they will infer all kinds of things without your even realizing that you have told them that, which means you will get different feedback depending on the kind of language used by the student or if you're giving them for assessment and so on. So one has to be extremely careful in these because you will not even realize that it is making those changes. That said, I feel this emphasis on how do we make things more efficient misses the point of the power of this technology. So I think we can and we can do better. So I'm going to give a few examples of some things that I have done which are really powerful. I have some research, my line of research, which looks at sort of the value of aesthetics in learning. That ideas in science and in math and in other fields are inherently beautiful and powerful, and that can be very motivating for students to learn. And what that means is that we need to approach things with a more transdisciplinary sort of perspective, that where we bring the sciences and the arts together. And in certain areas of the arts, I'm not very good. Music, I'm not very good at all. I don't know anything about, music, but I do know a lot about science and math and so on and visual design, that kind of stuff, right? So I did this where I asked Claude to create a song about the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says that, entropy keeps increasing or chaos keeps increasing, and that will be the end of the universe, will be this heat death of the universe. And that's both a very powerful idea, but also a very sort of strange but beautiful idea that we have this deep understanding of the universe. So I said, can you write me a song which captures both the scientific essence and its unfair beauty? Then I took that song and I put it into Suno, which is an AI system for creating music, gave it some prompts about how I wanted it to be. And now I have a beautiful song written almost entirely by AI with some tweaks by me, composed and rendered with zero input from me because I don't know music at all. And this allows me to sort of think about both science and art and the emotions behind it in a new way, which I could not, being me, we have never been able to do before. So I think, and again, you can go to the website and listen to this song. Here's another example. I don't know how many of you have heard of this idea of vibe coding, um, but this is a way of writing computer code just in English. So this is one that I created a little while ago. Um, this is, again, you can go and see this on my website. This looks at, oops, sorry. Okay. This was supposed to be an animation. It's not working. That's okay. So this is taking a unit circle, combining the idea of the Pythagorean theorem with sine and cosine waves, mapping sine and cosine to sound and to color. So there's a lot of knowledge about math and the world around us packed into this tiny little simulation, which basically took me half a day to create. It is written entirely in JavaScript and HTML. I know a little bit of HTML. I do not know any JavaScript. And it's a beautifully functioning simulation that can be used in a science classroom. So far, if you had to create a simulation like this, you needed a lot of money, needed software engineers, and so on. Now, pretty much anybody with some knowledge of the discipline can create it. Similarly, just using English, I have created simulation of bacteria and antibiotic resistance literally within minutes. Simulations that look at the gas laws, where pressure, the relationship between pressure, volume, temperature of a gas. That if you can change one of these, so all the different gas laws, you can see Boyle's law, Charles' law, all of those can be tested using this simulation. It's a very powerful learning tool. But more importantly, it's not the teacher making the tool necessarily, it's the students making the tool to show their understanding of the topic. I think that's the powerful thing, that it has made building such things accessible to anybody. The final one here is the simulation of a rhythm in Indian classical music. Again, one of my students was talking about this, and I realized that I don't know much about that. So I worked with ChatGPT and Claude to create this simulation, which teaches me about how that rhythmic set works. So that's, again, the point is not, these are not, the examples are not the point as much what they're pointing towards. That with knowledge of a domain, I can now create things that I could never have created before. And I think that's a really, really powerful tool for educators to start thinking about in creative ways rather than just for efficiency. So I think there is one fundamental challenge about incorporating generative AI in education. And the way I talk about it is, I wrote about this recently again on my website, in terms of, if you look at these four quadrants. So we have knowledge of a domain along the x-axis. So one corner, you have the people who have no knowledge of domain, and the other end, you have people who are experts in the domain. And that was sort of the traditional continuum that learners, and educators would be sitting at, where learners would be on the left-hand side, educators would be on the right-hand side. But now we have a different domain, the knowledge of AI. And there again, we can have low and high. So you could have somebody who's in the top left who has high knowledge of AI but does not understand content. So they are in trouble because they will take the output from AI and accept it blindly, which can lead them to all kinds of errors. The best place to be is the top right corner, because you are an expert in the domain, you know the domain really well, and you understand what AI does. And so you can really evaluate AI output and make even better. So people in that top right corner are going to be, their productivity is going to go really up. And that's where we want everybody to end up. But the problem is that our learners are actually sitting in the bottom left corner. They don't know the domain. They don't know the math or the sociology or the music or whatever the topic is. They don't have a judgment about it. They don't have expertise in it. They cannot tell good from bad information in that space. They do not understand how knowledge is generated and evaluated in those domains. On top of it, they don't know AI, so they have a double jeopardy, which is they, the outputs of AI, they will accept it unquestioning in an unquestioning manner, which puts them at great risk. Educators, on the other hand, I think for most part are sitting either at the expert level, and if they have generation knowledge of AI, they are at the top right corner because they can work with the AI to improve their because they have the expertise to judge the output, to be able to then take that and edit it and change it. So our goal is really to move educators who are sitting in the bottom right corner to the top right corner so that they can help learners move diagonally across, right? So this map sort of, I think this chart really lays out, I think quite nicely, sort of the essential conundrum that learners face. So in some ways, I feel generative AI is more of a teacher's tool right now than it's a learner's tool, but we can discuss that in the Q&A. So keeping all of this in mind, my colleagues, Nicole Oster and Lindsay McKeleb and I have come up with this sort of AI integrated design for education framework, a framework for teaching and learning with AI. So first of all, it recognizes that AI is a smart drunk intern. It's brilliant but unpredictable. It's creative but needs supervision. It's capable but needs guidance. And the teachers are the critical designers in this space. The TPAC is a framework for technology knowledge that I developed many years ago. I co-developed many years ago. Not really relevant in this point. But the teachers are designers not just of the artifacts that students use for their learning, but also processes, experiences, systems, and culture. And that's what allows them to create powerful learning experiences for the students. And that we have to value teacher expertise and judgment. Because as you saw in that quadrants, they need to be sitting at the top right. They're already in the bottom right. They need to be moving up there. And it's their expertise and judgment that is critical in this space. I have talked about a lot of these things already, so I won't really go into it much, but you understand the core properties of Gen AI, that it's generative, it makes things up, it's social, it's opaque, it's unstable, multimodal, and so on. But how do teachers use it? So we think about it in terms of phases. It's like use it to create first drafts of ideas. So see it as a way of co-design, collaborative planning of curriculum, materials, and activities, that co-delivery, real-time teaching support, and adaptive content presentation as you're going, and co-assessment. So in each case, the teacher is the one in control, right? That AI suggests, humans decide. Leverage teacher expertise, maintain a pedagogical focus. And I think recognizing that this is going to be an iterative process, that AIs are going to make mistakes, we are going to make mistakes, and it is in that combined way that we can sort of create unexpected creative outputs, because LLMs are really good at brainstorming. That's one of the most powerful things that they can do. And I think that there is an ethical component to it of doing the right thing, which is that we need to be, just as we expect our students to be transparent, we need to be transparent about how we are using it. We need to recognize bias. We need to protect privacy. There is so much of the data of our students and we need to deeply understand the technology, which is why the large part of my talk, the first half, I really wanted to emphasize what this technology is. I think that's really important. I think there's a lot of myths about this technology, but I hope that through some of those examples, particularly the ones about optical illusions and those diagrams that it was creating, to recognize what it can and cannot do. And so that basically brings us to be, as teachers, as being designers of these educational technology rather than being passive users of this technology. And I think that's something that I've held very dear. If you look at my entire career over 30 years now, that the critical role played by the educator in this space cannot be overemphasized. That you'll hear a lot of hype about that, oh, this can personalize learning, it can become a personalized tutor. The evidence on that is very sketchy. This has been promised for decades and decades. You can go back and read Bill Gates' speeches from 30 years ago. And he's been saying the same thing. The only thing that's changed is changed the name of the technologies. It was the internet, it was Wikipedia, it was laptops, whatever, right? Um, but once teachers are in charge, they can see this technology as a possibility engine, as an engine for creating change, as one who's a Socratic opponent who can push them to think harder about their topics and how to better represent it as a collaboration coach, as a co-designer, as a space to explore, maybe to storytelling and simulations that I just talked about. But it is a chance to simulate these interactions that are happening in classroom and to become better as an educator. At the end of the day, I think we have to remember this basic fact that AI does not care about the truth. I hope that has become very clear in what I've said, that they are completely divorced from the real world. They exist in this own little space of correlations and probabilities. But at the bottom line is AI just doesn't care, right? That's not what it is about. It is not a sentient being. It is not one that has any feelings or emotions. Anything it says is just it just says those words, and we can possibly fall into that trap, but we have to be really careful that we don't. But just because AI doesn't care doesn't mean that we don't care. I think we deeply care as educators. That is our superpower. That's why we are in this field, and that's why I think this is the greatest profession of all, because we are devoted to the future. We are devoted. Education, if anything, is about the future. It's about the future of our learners who are in our care. It's about the future of the planet and so on, right? And I think when we come to these new technologies, there is this urge, where this is the famous statement from Mark Zuckerberg, like move fast and break things. And you can see the consequences of that move fast and break things on the world around us. We are more separated from each other, more isolated from each other because we did not care enough about these kinds of things and the consequences of our actions. So, as educators, I think this is not what we do. What we do is we move intentionally and we nurture things. And I think that's really important to recognize that there will be a lot of pressure on you. Oh my God, if you're not using AI, you're falling behind. Your students are falling behind. Take a breath. It's okay. This technology is changing. It's okay because the critical powers that we bring to the task is a deep understanding of the process of teaching and learning, a deep understanding of learners and what they need, a caring for their growth and development. And AI can help in that, but it cannot be the replacement of that. And so I think sometimes we sell ourselves short, like, oh, we need to keep running after this new thing. I play with these technologies all the time, but I know when and when not to use it and when to use it. At ASU, we have this framework for principal innovation. And I think that that sort of guides how we think about using these technologies is the ability to imagine new concepts and catalyze ideas. Again, ASU, number one in innovation. We must have told you that a million times. Or you must have seen it in every poster around, and form new solutions, but always guided by principles that create positive change for humanity. So I think that, I hope through this, I'm coming to the end of my talk, uh, through this process of going through trying to understand what this technology is, what it can do, what it cannot do, how its disconnection with truth, how it works, to then come up with models and approaches that recognize its strengths and weaknesses and use it as a core design as a partner, knowing always that given its limitations, that we will need that expertise will be critical in that process. So just going to keep this in mind. The chatbots are smart, drunk biased, supremely confident interns. They're always available. They're eager to help. But to remember that without our filter, that none of this stuff is going to be actually useful to our learners. So with that, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. I'm going to switch off my sharing. This is again my contact information. And as I said, always my website, almost everything I do, all of these experiments I've talked about are on my website. I do reply to every email I get and would love to connect with you on LinkedIn, which is where I share a lot of the work that I do. With that, Amelia, I'm going to push back to you and shut down sharing.
Thank
There
you.
we go.
Thank you so much, Professor Mishra, for that insightful talk. I'm going to go ahead and project Professor Mishra's contact information here on the screen. So if any of you, need to look at this some more time, we are now going to answer questions from the Q&A. So the first audience member to ask a question here, Nils, asks, students might tend to improve AI skills over improving expert knowledge, which would increase the false confidence. How can we create awareness that data does not equal truth and that expert knowledge is needed to differentiate between the mere prompt results and quality discoveries for AI overconfident students?
I think it's a great question, and that's one that I think that is truly the big struggle for us. I mean, for all of us in this space right now, because for two reasons. So that happened. Like these AI systems have been designed. They don't have to be designed this way. They have deliberately been designed that way to be appear supremely confident. First of all, right? So it'll always be like, oh, this is the thing, and you say, no, you're wrong. It's like, oh, you're right. I'm wrong. But and then be supremely confident about the opposite. That false sense of confidence is there. Second thing that these have is sycophantic. They're always trying to please you. And if you think about the role of a true educator, it's not necessarily trying to please the student. It's to be respectful to the student. But if a student has a mistaken idea or a misconception about something, to nudge back, push back, try to understand the student's reasoning and tweak that. So one of the things that I think some of the examples that I showed you today are part of my strategy in weakening this sort of link between, or whatever AI says is right. Nobody can look at that red circle illusion, but I give a massive red circle and AI says, oh, those two circles are the same size. What? And then I actually use the advanced reasoning models. Actually, not me, Melissa Ward, whose picture you saw. She used an advanced reasoning model and said, you are wrong. Those two, one circle is bigger than the other. Then it said, let me write some computer code to measure it. And it spent 15 minutes writing code, doing whatever. At the end, it said, they are slightly different from each other. One is 50 pixels wide, the other is 50.5 pixels wide. And there is no such thing as a zero point 0.5 of a pixel. A pixel is one. There is no smaller than a pixel in the computer screen land. So and I think so giving students opportunities to ask it to draw a diagram of the solar system, something that they know. And then it hits them that, oh my God, this thing, I'm trying to use this for my homework. It doesn't know its head from a hole in the ground. And that I need to judge. So that's one. Once I wrote this blog post about those four quadrants, and I started puzzling over this thing. Like, how? Because these learners are sitting in this corner. What do we do? Then the other aspect hit me is that most of schooling and education has become divorced from things that students care about. And if you care about something, you will want to get it right, not to please the teacher, but because you care about it. So that I wrote this whole blog post about like how we need to bring care and concern back into the space, love for learning back into the space, and I have some ideas there. I don't want to go on and on with just one question, but thank you for that question because I think that's a very important one, and some of my initial thoughts are on my website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your answer, Professor Mishra. I would like to draw the audience's attention to the screen once more. If you would like a participation badge for today's webinar, you will get one if you signed up for this webinar with your school's email address, with the email address that you use for your university. But if you did not, go ahead and email asusupport@centana.com, or you can WhatsApp this number to further inquire. Okay, so the next question here we have for you, Professor Mishra, is if an AI were to develop a form of subjective experience in the future, how could we determine whether it is genuine consciousness or merely an advanced simulation of human perception?
Thank you, Roberto, for that question. And I wish I had a good answer for you, but that's one thing that I have thought about a lot, and I really don't have an answer. And the way there's a great interview with Ezra Klein does with the speculative science fiction writer Ted Chiang. And Ted Chiang said something there which really literally changed my life. So Ted Chiang talked about like how as humans we have treated others, whoever we have declared to be the other, whether it might be a person of a different color, whether it might be an animal of a different species, whether it might be somebody with a different religious perspective, and so on. We have had no problem treating that group horribly. That's the history of the human race. The sad history of the human race is that once we other somebody, once we declare them to be less than human, we do not care about their suffering. That's how we are. And he said that as these AI systems grow, that there is going to be a deep moral issue here because we will create systems which will suffer. It'll in the beginning be the consciousness of a cockroach and maybe of a rat and then maybe of a dog, and before it reaches full human, consciousness or whatever level of consciousness it may. And he said that what he fears is that we are going to cause immense suffering to these artificial agents. And that was one of the reasons 4 years ago, listening to this and a few other things, I became vegetarian. And I was like, I don't want to be part of the suffering that's happening to the animal kingdom. And it's partly from this sort of discussion that I heard Ted Chiang speak about. I do think it's a very important question. And I really don't know how we will be able to distinguish. And the history, our history as a species, shows that we have been incredibly cruel to anybody who we declare as the other. And it's the piece about consciousness and suffering that bothers me greatly, but I really don't have an answer to that. But it's a transfer. I love the question because it was transformative for me personally.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Mishra. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next question, but before we do, audience, please draw your attention to the screen here. I have a QR code for you to scan. If you could please scan the QR code and fill out today's survey, that would be fantastic. Just tell us what you think of the webinar. We are always looking to improve our webinars for the future. Okay, so our next question here, a simple but powerful question from Z, says, would generative AI push the digital divide more significantly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned there in the beginning is just in terms of the data that it is trained on, right? It is trained on a subset of all the stuff that's been digitized, right? But most of the digitization has happened in what are known as the weird countries, so Western industrialized, WEI, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? So at democratic, we can draw a question mark on maybe, but at least it's WEIR for sure, right? Um, what that means is when I've tried to translate, let's say, things that I've written into Spanish and given them to Spanish language speakers, they say, oh, this is a great translation. When I translate something into Bengali and I give it to a Bengali language speaker, they said, oh my God, this is a horrible translation. It's a very archaic form of Bengali. That's because it's been trained on old texts, which are the only ones which are available in the digital realm. Not enough digitization has happened there. Just the example of bias that I showed you when I asked for a diagram of the ear, nose, throat system, there was no reason it had to be a white person's cross section. Even if it made up all the garbage inside, it didn't have to be a white person. So I think that these divides are already there. So I've written about sort of what this idea of flattening of culture that happens because certain things when you ask ChatGPT sitting in Korea or in Nigeria, it will give answers which are maybe more culturally valid here while not necessarily within that culture. And so you're going to see. So that's one divide which I think is worrisome. At the same time, these models are incredibly expensive. Very few people can afford to pay the $20 a month for ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it is, the subscription. Well, ChatGPT has a $200 a month thing. And now they're saying they're going to come up with a $20,000 a month, which will be the equivalent of having a PhD student. That's what they claim. I don't buy it. I don't believe it necessarily. They're full of hype and one needs to be careful. But who can afford a $20,000 a month smart drunk, occasionally biased, supremely confident intern? Not me, right? And so if I am sitting here in this extremely privileged position, cannot afford that, there are lots of people in the world. So we will have weaker, smaller, less well-trained, more, breakable models across the world than will be in certain privileged spaces. So absolutely, it is going to make the digital divide worse. No doubt in my mind about it. And we need to be very, very cognizant of that fact.
Thank you so much for your answer. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question. Um, Audience member asks, what is the best way to teach critical thinking to students so they never lose the ability to think for themselves and question everything?
So one of the things, it's a great question, and I'm smiling because this was when my kids were little. Even now, I never gave them a straight answer to anything. I would just make stuff up, and they're like, "Papa, you're the worst." I said, "Like, don't trust your dad, and that means don't trust anything, right? Verify always." Basically, what it has meant is they trust everything but me. So that plan didn't work out very well. But I think that there is no one shot answer to the critical thinking question. I think there are going to be a variety of strategies that we'll have to use through the curriculum. But at the end of the day, comparing what you get from a newspaper article or it may be an output of ChatGPT across sources, learning to develop ways of verifying information. So those examples that I gave, of the illusions and so on, are a way of having students develop critical thinking that be suspicious of the output of large language models. That's the subtext, but it's being handed to them in a way that they recognize. Then asking them to do these experiments, like, can you find ways to trip LLMs? And it's a great game. They come up with new ways. I mean, many of them I didn't come up with, like the clock one I heard from somebody, from one of my students. So there are these things that we can inculcate in them. Also understanding what the underlying social and economic roles are within this space. So when my kids were little, when they used to watch television, I used to ask them, like, why are these programs made so interesting? And they'd say, because they want us to watch the programs. I said, no, they make the programs interesting so that you watch the ads in between the programs. The real machine is selling you your eyeballs to make you buy whatever, Dino trucks or, Build a Bear or whatever it may be, right? The programs are the chocolate to suck you in. So once you get that framing, or you think about social media, why is social media designed the way it is? It is to make us stay on that website so that they can get more data about you, so that they can target ads to you. Once you understand that, so I think those are the kinds of conversations we need to be having very early. We pretty much don't have a space for these kinds of critical conversations. And I think that's incredibly important that we do. I don't think that there ever will be a single solution. I also don't think that we are critical in every aspect of our being. I think I'm critical. I'm a critical thinker in certain things, and other things I'm as gullible as the other guy. And to recognize that we will always, there will be these elements, because it's very hard to be a critical thinker for everything. When Emilia, you're nodding your head, I have to sort of be like, okay, she's agreeing with me, and whatever, right? If I am always sort of second guessing every piece of information I get, I'll just be sitting here doing nothing. So critical thinking, knowing when to pull it out, when to be accepting, I think those are important skills. But again, I don't think there is a one shot answer to it. It is going to be thinking through the life experience of learners.
Mm, yeah. Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Mishra. Um, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Samara from the audience asks, in a future where AI systems not only personalize learning but also guide career pathways, assess cognitive potential, and influence curricula, how can society ensure that the education system remains adaptable, equitable, and resistant to reinforcing socioeconomic disparities, biases, or AI driven determinism?
Thank you for this question, Samira. So I'm going to actually question the premise of the question, and I think it will lead you to the answer, and that will lead to the answer. I think that this future where people are talking about where it'll personalize learning and guide career pathways and assist cognitive influence career, I think a lot of that is hype. I don't think these technologies are there yet. And even if they are, what are we going to give up in terms of information and data about ourselves for these be able to guide us? Now, the second part of your question, which is critical, how can we that they're equitable and resistant to reinforcing socioeconomic disparities? I'm going to bet good money that this hype around personalized learning and all of that stuff is going to be pushed to the more socioeconomic and the marginalized people as a solution to education for them. I had this great quote from one of the persons whose job he was the vice president of global expansion of Facebook. When he was asked, do his kids use Facebook? He literally, this is the quote, he said, I don't let them touch that SHIT. So this is a quote from the guy whose job is globalization of the product. Okay. So, what I worry is that this hype that this technology can solve this, can do this personalized and so on, will be pushed onto the more marginalized, will be pushed onto as solutions to what are deeper systemic problems of healthcare and educate, socioeconomic, poverty and so on and so forth. So that's my worry, that this technology will be pushed into those spaces because the people who have the resources will send their children to schools where there will be human teachers with AI. Yes, I'm not saying don't use AI, but as an all encompassing solution, it will be pushed onto groups who actually have the least need of it. And that I think is deeply problematic. So I think that we have to be very, very careful about the hype around this technology. I use this tool every day. Don't get me wrong. I am not a Luddite or anti AI technology and so on, but I'm also very clear-eyed about what it can do and what the hype says that it can do. When the hype becomes reality, fine. But till then, let's be extremely suspicious of a lot of these claims. I mean, you can just see Salman Khan's TED talk that he gave 3 years ago versus what his company and what he's saying today. There's a dramatic difference between, like, oh, this is going to be the solution to personalized tutoring, best tutor for every child in the world, to, oh, this becomes a teacher's aid where a teacher you have to accept reality at some point. I want to be very, very careful about that.
Yep. Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Mishra. Um, I will go ahead and go on to our next slide before we answer our last question. And so, our next innovation talk, please scan this QR code to register. And yes, it will actually be about using virtual reality in foreign language learning, a research based approach. And it will be given by yours truly. So feels a little awkward advertising for my own webinar, but here it is.
So, are you going to ask yourself questions and moderate and introduce yourself?
I think Lois will be doing that for
Okay.
me. Yeah, but that would be an interesting thing to do. And
Or you could create an AI version of yourself to do that.
that's very true.
There
That's
you go.
very true. A little scary, but very, very true. I might have to try that someday. Okay, so let's go ahead and ask our last question here. Um, Isabella asks, what do you think is the best way for students and future generations to maintain enthusiasm and mindset for learning new things, given the rapid advancements in AI and its increasing role in our lives?
That's a great question. And again, I'll point you to my blog because I wrote something about this literally 2 weeks ago. So as I said, I'd done this piece around the four quadrants, and I was really struggling with learners sitting in the bottom left quadrant. And I think I mentioned this earlier that this caring for what you do, I think becomes really important. A lot of school has become disconnected from the lives of our students, which is why they feel okay in cutting corners or cheating or whatever it may be, because it's not important to them. But I continued that by talking about something that John Dewey talked about a century ago, which he called the four primary impulses for learning. And I think that, whether it's young learners or adult learners, these four things still apply. The four impulses are inquiry. We love finding things out. That's just something humans are like natural at. If there's something that we don't understand, it bothers us till we sort of get an answer. So inquiry is one. Next thing is we like building things, whether it's building a theory or building a block house or building whatever, right? Or website, we like building things. So construction. The third is communication. We love interacting with each other, sharing ideas, learning, doing that kind of stuff. And the fourth is expression, which is sort of the aesthetic and the artistic personal element that we bring to everything that we do. So he said that these are the four primary impulses. And I really think whether AI or no AI, whatever it may be, as long as we tap into these four primary impulses, the impulse to learn, to inquiry, construction, communication, and expression, I think our education will be in good stand. If you look at a lot of the education that we do, it is concerned with none of that. It is not driven by any sense of inquiry by the student. It is more of this is good for you, hence you have to take it. Very rarely are we asking them to build anything. Are we asking them to build a theory? Are we asking them to build a new framework for X, Y, and Z? No. We just say learn this and solve these problems. There is very little space. We sit in rows, and there is no space for sort of communication of ideas around, discussion and so on. And finally, there is almost no personal sort of aesthetic element involved. I think those are the problems with education today, and those AI has may help with one or the other. But I think if we go back to those four primary impulses, I think we'll have a much better approach towards education and learning.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Mishra. Unfortunately, we never have time to answer all of the questions that our attendees are asking. So, audience, I hope that was enough for you. And thank you so much, Dr. Mishra.
Thank
And
you.
Everybody be well, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.